Welcome, everyone. My name is Daniel Seal. I'm a historical sociologist and PhD candidate here in the sociology department, and I'm honored to introduce today's speaker on behalf of the Havens Rights Center. The Havens Rights Center was established in the sociology department as named for A. Eugene Havens and Eric Olin Wright, two scholars whose careers embodied the combination of rigorous scholarship and commitment to social justice the center carries forward. Abdel Razzaq Takriti is Associate Professor of History and holds the Arab American Educational Foundation Chair in Arab Studies at Rice University. He received his doctorate from St. Antony's College, Oxford, and taught at Oxford and the University of Sheffield before coming to the United States. He was the founding director of the Arab American Educational Foundation Center for Arab Studies at the University of Houston, and served in 2022 and 2023 as the Mahmoud Darwish Visiting Chair in Palestinian Studies at Brown University. His research spans anti-colonialism, revolutionary movements, intellectual history, and state formation in the modern Arab world. His book, Monsoon Revolutions, Republican Sultans and Empires in Oman, published by Oxford University Press, is a landmark study of a revolution that received little attention in Western accounts at the time and has been under-examined since, one that illuminates how revolutionary movements in the Arab world were entangled with Cold War imperial competition in ways long obscured by traditional historiographical frameworks. He is the co-author of the Palestinian Revolution Digital Humanities Project, and he has published in venues including the American Historical Review and Radical History Review. And I want to add one more thing about his work that is not in the official bio. Together with Daniel Denver, Professor Takriti created Thawra, a podcast series hosted by The Dig, running, I think, about 40 hours, covering modern Arab and Palestinian radicalisms and anti-colonialism. The series is a model of what public scholarship can be, and will be rigorous, historically grounded, and genuinely accessible without sacrificing depth. I'd encourage anyone who hasn't listened to it to do so. His talk is titled Gaza and the U.S. Academy, Scholasticide and Educational Resilience in Palestine. Please join me in welcoming Professor Abdel Razzaq Takriti.
Thank you very much. And I really appreciate this very, very generous introduction and a great hosting here. Thanks to our colleagues and thanks to Adrian for arranging everything. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be with you all, especially the Havens Rights Center, which of course carries an important legacy in the study and promotion of social justice. Now, I'm going to be talking about the U.S. Academy and the situation in Gaza as it relates particularly to higher education and the scholasticide that is experienced there. And I should note that this is the right space to talk about that, because this is a space that has critically examined the social situation in this country, but also as it intersects with global dynamics. And I can't think of a more revealing example of this intersection than what is going on in Gaza today, because this is an American genocide, although it's promoted primarily by the State of Israel, is carried out by the State of Israel, but it could not have been carried out without the U.S. support, the diplomatic, financing, and military fronts. U.S. officials have been making genocidal statements that are just as extreme as Israeli genocidal statements. They've called, including the president himself, has called for the destruction of Gaza, the removal of its population, its repurposing for realistic purposes. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, belongs to a family that has long been committed to the project of the destruction of the Palestinian people. They funded the settler movement all their lives, and they've been very much part and parcel of the effort to eradicate our people. In addition to that, you have elected officials that may be driven sometimes by cynical motivations, such as lobbying or receiving money or targeting particular audiences and constituencies. But then you have also others that believe that God is talking to them, that they have a mission to replace the Palestinian people with Jews from across the world, so as to ensure the second coming of Christ. There are also others that are coming in with the attitude that is very racist and colonialist. Who cares if a few million Palestinians are destroyed, are denied existence, are removed from the face of this earth? So we have all of these dynamics going on. It's a very American dynamic. Genocide denial has become basically the norm in this country on the official level, despite the fact that on the popular level, and this is the new dynamic that is developing in this country, on the popular level, there is recognition that something deeply wrong is happening. I've been, exposed to dynamics in this country for a long time around Palestine, and I can say that throughout the past at least quarter century, I've never seen anything like this in terms of popular recognition of what's going on in Palestine. In the past, there was a lot of ignorance. Palestine was not recognizable even on the map. Now I think people know that there's something deeply wrong unfolding there. However, the crisis of the Gaza genocide has revealed also that there's a democratic deficit here and elsewhere, in the same way that the Iraq War a couple of decades earlier revealed the severe democratic deficit. The population can think whatever it wants to think, but the people in power will do whatever they want to do. In the academy, we're seeing this in very extreme ways. But I should say that while we have general recognition that there's something wrong happening in Gaza, there is general silence, which is why I'm going to start by saying that the old U.S. Academy died in Gaza. It died when somebody like Abdel Takriti eulogized their 4 children as their little bodies were left to rot for months. Their 8-year-old Liam and 6-year-old twins Kenan and Orkida and 2-year-old Carmel were staying at their grandmother's house in Khan Younis when Israeli forces invaded the city in early December 2023. Dozens of soldiers broke into the property, abducted all the men, stole all the money that was left with the women, and destroyed the gas pipes as well as the water tanks. They searched everyone and took away their cell phones and chargers, except for a hidden one that they had missed. And the women and children wanted to leave to a safer area, but the soldiers did not allow them, laying siege around them instead. Yemen discreetly called his mother, informing her of the tanks surrounding the house and the military bulldozers that had demolished the fence and part of the borders. Alaa's relative Imtinan also texted her from the same device. And I'm quoting her here. "We are dying. They are burying us alive and are demolishing the house on top of us." End of quote. Alaa was a prominent poet that was also employed by the UN as a teacher, reached out to the ICRC to try to save her children and relatives. Officials from the organization rudely told her off, saying that they have no power to liaise with the Israelis over such a matter. Other international bodies also dismissed her appeal. Days later, on the 30th of December 2023, she asked to call her children again. Yemen told her, quote, "They have now demolished the wall of the room that Kenan, Orkida, Carmel, and I sleep in." But he innocently reassured her that, quote, "the television was not destroyed." Kenan and Orkida then grabbed the phone, telling her that they are afraid and are unable to sleep. In the background, the mother could hear her toddler daughter, Carmel, crying, "Mama, Mama." The line got cut, and she never heard the voices of her children again. She kept sending them texts to no avail for the next 2 months, unable to find out what happened to them. Finally, one of the children's uncles braved the fire of the Israeli drones hovering all over the Gaza Strip, reaching the house on February 21, 2024, so several weeks later. He sent Ala a text informing her that the house was demolished on top of all those that were in it. It took 2 months for rescue teams to be able to remove the rubble and recover the bodies of the children, and to this day, no one knows the precise moment in which Israeli forces buried them alive under piles of shattered cement and steel. Now, for Ala, giving birth, just like staying alive now, was a struggle, where she had faced complications in every delivery. Now, after all was lost, no one can possibly fathom her pain except for those who have experienced the greatest affliction. Steeped in the Arab Islamic tradition of the humanities, she could only comprehend her calamity with reference to the martyrdom of Hussein. That's the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad. I see the eyes of Hussein. I see the eyes of Hussein in my eyes. I see in my eyes the eyes of Hussein. They have left the son of my heart slaughtered, the debris blocking him with the sunrise, and I carry shattering above my shattering, and the back laid on 2 daggers, screaming. The pathway of the great Imam was abandoned to face the forces of tyranny alone, losing his sons and his own life in the process. Ala was experiencing her own private Karbala. Her only solace was writing to her kids. She sent them a letter to the heavens. Quote, "My 4 children, Yamin, Kenan, Orkida, and Carmel. I know that you are alive in the care of God Almighty and that you can hear me. So I write to you, and I will continue to write to you, for you are always with me." She asked them, "I wonder, how does my tent look to you from the sky? How do you watch the doves going over frail, waterless flowers? And how do you behold my longing that lights fire under the pots? For I have discovered a burning in my bosom that suffices for all the women on earth." Allah translated the fire raging inside her into words, language, acquired 2 years of engagement with the humanities and academic study. This did not only give her a medium of communication with her most beloved children, but it also gave her refuge, an ethereal refuge that could not be offered by the material world. For what earthly refuge can possibly exist in a land in which all buildings are bombed and even makeshift tents are attacked, their residents burnt alive? The poets of Gaza experienced the meanings of this for the children of the territory. We see this in Rawan Hussein's haunting poem, foretelling and confirming again and again the loneliness of Palestinians in Gaza, a terror of fearing for and then losing thousands upon thousands of frightened children. Now reading from her, time stepped aside and the places closed their eyes, just like a child in whose eyeballs the words went gray. The ceilings collapsed like a waterfall made of rocks. Underneath their debris remains a picture hanging upon what we saw last. The portrait of the last fright, sculpted upon our faces. Alone we grow old tonight. We knit time and wear it. We devour the horror that flows out of the mouths of our little ones. Who is devouring our rusty mouths? The loneliness of Palestinians in Gaza was also expressed by Hiba Abu Nada, another colleague. Early into the genocide, she had predicted with the prescience of those approached by death that Gaza would be abandoned to the slaughter. How alone are we? Everyone else won their wars, but you were left naked, facing your lone self. No poem, dear Darwish, will return what has vanished and what the lonely has lost. How alone are we? This is the age of ignorance, and no one will back us. Early into the genocide, Hiba wrote on social media, quote, "The sound we hear is the sound of death that has bypassed us to choose others. We are still alive hearing the sound of the death of others that we know, and we say, thank God the last sound they heard was not the sound of the rocket, for those who hear the sound of the rocket survive." A few days later, Hiba did not hear the sound of the rocket. She was murdered by an Israeli airstrike in Khan Yunis, the city in which her family sought refuge after being ethnically cleansed in 1948 from their ancestral village, Beit Gaza. Now, The humanity of the Palestinian people is still alive in the works of Ala, Rawan, Iba, and many other writers, scholars, and thinkers. Our humanity is still alive in those works. All were or are waiting for the inferno to end. All wish for themselves a world free of genocide, free of the tyranny of others. In one of her last posts, Hiba wrote, quote, "Above, we are building a second city. Doctors without patience and blood, teachers without overpacked classrooms and shouts at the students, new families without pain or sorrow, journalists taking pictures of paradise, and poets writing on eternal love. All from Gaza, all." The targeted assault on people like the three poets I've mentioned, and they're all scholars, these are all colleagues, did not generate much traction in the US Academy. You had individual voices talking about it, people maybe in their private homes, but not a single university took a major initiative to support colleagues in Gaza. In the meantime, they had hundreds of initiatives to support Israeli colonial institutions. And in many cases, these initiatives include partnerships with the Israeli military and the Israeli military industry. A growing number of reports now have confirmed this from different campus environments, including my own campus. We uncovered the fact that there's a lot of research going on to support Israeli military activities directly, by the way, with companies that are tied to the idea. And these military developments are being used to target colleagues in multiple sectors, not just poets, not just humanities scholars, but also scholars who are engaged in important aspects of the social reproduction process in Palestine. So we have many different examples of this, and I'm going to give you quite a few because they illustrate what I am talking about. We have, for example, the case of the food systems. Okay. So Gaza has a very important institution, one major college of agriculture and veterinary sciences, and veterinary medicine, sorry. And it was engaged in important research on food production in contexts where you have a very high density of the population, as the highest density of population on earth, because it, of course, had to absorb all the Palestinian refugees that were expelled and ethnically cleansed in 1948 from southern Palestine. The majority of those that were expelled or ethnically cleansed in southern Palestine ended up in Gaza, because, of course, Gaza was the seat of that district, and the Egyptian army managed to protect it against further takeover by Jewish colonists in 1948. So it was not absorbed to the Israeli state, but the colonists expelled the native population to it. As a result, you have in an area that's very tiny, 240 square kilometers, it's much smaller than any major or any even decent sized U.S. city. Okay, you have to have agricultural land. You have to have also living quarters for 2.3 million people. So it causes an immense crisis of food production. Nevertheless, there were people that were engaged in that research. And it included also wonderful students like Yusuf Abu Rabia, who was a 24-year-old student pursuing a degree in agriculture engineering at Azhar University, Gaza, where this department that I'm referring to is located. And this was the most committed and one of the most bright, one of the brightest of his cohort, the students in his cohort. He used his knowledge to grow crops, promote food sovereignty, and sustain life in the face of the famine spreading in Gaza as a result of Israel's genocidal campaign. You know, here you have students that become entrepreneurial at a young age. They build businesses, make money. This student was directing his energies elsewhere. He was actually trying to keep his people alive, trying to allow them to survive in the face of a genocide. Now, he cleared the rubble of his destroyed home after the bombing of Beit Lahia alongside his brother. And the two of them started a plant nursery that produced over 200,000 plants. They have a long family tradition of farming, of course. And they cultivated vegetables amid the ruins, distributed seedlings and food to Palestinians facing acute hunger in northern Gaza after October 7, 2023, and did enormous services to sustaining people in the face of the mass starvation that was going on. Now, while delivering fresh produce to enable October 22, 2024, Yusuf, who, by the way, incidentally, is a student of a very good friend of mine, Professor Ahmed Abu Shaban, was targeted and killed by an Israeli drone. This is hard. No, it's not an isolated tragedy. So it's part of a systematic campaign to prevent people from utilizing knowledge in the service of society. In this case, utilizing knowledge to keep people alive, keep people away from hunger. It's what we refer to as scholasticide, which is a core component of genocide. It's actually one of the arenas in which we see the genocide unfolding in its totality. Sandy Desai and I developed a criteria around scholasticide. Originally, the concept was coined by an old mentor of mine, Professor Carmen Abulsi, to refer to the earlier assaults on Gaza in 2009, 2008, 2009. But then now it's assumed a totally different scale. Originally, when Professor Abulsi had formulated, she was thinking of the systematic destruction of education. They were attacking universities, they were targeting them, they were bombing them, and they were, of course, killing some of our colleagues. But now what we were seeing is a pattern of annihilation, which is a totally different phenomenon. When you get to the annihilation phase, it means that you leave nothing. You try to destroy everything. And you try to kill as much as possible. This is why every major university building in Gaza has been bombed. And most are bombed beyond repair. Many of them were detonated after having been used by the Israeli forces as military bases. In this country, they come and tell you on TV, oh, well, Hamas operatives are using these buildings. We saw that over and over again. Okay, people coming and saying that. Well, how are Hamas operatives using buildings that are already illegally used by the Israeli army as army bases? Which, by the way, is illegal. You cannot use educational facilities as army base. You cannot use hospitals as army base. They were doing all of that. How are they housing Hamas operatives if they're being detonated in a planned manner over the course of several days? They're taking their time with it. They're posting, the Israeli soldiers are posting on social media, both celebrating the burning of books, burning of educational material. The Islamic University Library, which is the largest library in Gaza, houses 250,000 academic books. Are these academic books housing Hamas operatives? Or are they housing important ideas? The target was actually our people and its ability to reproduce itself, its ability to reproduce knowledge, its ability to carry out an institutional life. So we're seeing here a situation where there's this outrageous complicity between the officialdom in the United States and the disruption of higher education sector and at the same time, total silence on the part of university leaderships. The disruption of the social reproduction process continued and continues to this very day, even after the ceasefire. And there are good examples of this that will clarify how extreme the situation how extreme the situation is when we look especially at the medical schools. We've looked now at poets in the humanities. We've taken a look at food systems, how they disrupt that through the killing of people, targeted killings, but also, of course, the destruction of the facilities and the farms. And think about the universities as they deliver medical education. And there are two medical schools in Gaza. One is at Islamic University of Gaza. On the 21st of March 2025, the Israeli forces detonated the Turkish-Palestinian Friendship Hospital, which is the main facility that is used by the Islamic University, the main teaching university there. And it's the only specialized cancer treatment center in Gaza. Okay? So when you destroy this, you basically bring all cancer services across Gaza to a halt. No cancer patients can receive any care in Gaza today. Of course, they were already facing challenges because of the denial of medicines. How are you going to have your chemotherapy? How are you going to have your basic care taken care of if there's no supplies? Think of all the people that have suffered and died, and that those numbers, by the way, are not reported in the very, very minimal estimates that are issued in Gaza. The estimates of the numbers, the actual proven numbers of people that are being killed these are not estimates. These are actual official numbers, 73,000 plus now. But they do not include all the cancer patients that have died as a result of the destruction of the IUG medical facility, the Turkish-Palestinian Friendship Hospital. They don't include all the people that have died from famine, from hunger, that have died as a result of the destruction of the farms and the killing of people like Yusuf. Now, the faculty of medicine itself, and this is an established pattern that I've already referred to, was already being used as a military base by Israeli forces during the first ground invasion in October 2022. So before they bombed it, they had been using it extensively. They have rendered it inaccessible for over a year due to its proximity to the heavily militarized Netzarim corridor. And in March 2025, following the end of the temporary ceasefire, Israeli forces blew up the Faculty of Medicine building on top of the hospital. So by doing that, they destroyed all core facilities, including anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, microbiology, histology, and pathology laboratories. Okay, so no more research in these fields and no more actual testing in these fields, and no more clinical work in these fields, because also the clinical and surgical skills lab were destroyed. And in addition to that, just to add and ensure and confirm the destruction, the video conference hall, the medical libraries, the lecture halls, and staff offices were also destroyed. They like to destroy everything. They're pretty democratic when it comes to their destruction. The faculty's website was also shut down, and that severed access to essential educational materials. Okay? So you have, and that, by the way, was one of the first things they did in the Scholasticide campaign. That aspect of the genocide deals with the annihilation of education, because they actually shut down all the servers of the main universities in Gaza, which meant that for a while they could not operate. And when we were working to restore operations in Gaza, and by we, I'm talking about the emergency committee for Gaza universities. I'll tell you about it maybe later, the Q&A. The difficulty that we had to deal initially was the servers. When you don't have servers, you don't have student databases, you don't have faculty databases, you cannot run a university. And it's so dependent nowadays on that. So the first challenge was to restore the servers, and that had to be done outside of Gaza because Israel has destroyed all these facilities inside. Now, when it comes to death, since October 2023, at least 20 IUG medical students, as well as multiple faculty members, were murdered by Israeli forces. These included prominent doctors that are rare in their specialties in Gaza. Usually they're actually the only specialist in their field. People like Dr. Omar Furwana is a gynecologist and former dean. Dr. Mohammed Dabou is a cancer pathologist and supervisor of preclinical stage. Dr. Hammam was a nephrologist and lecturer. The loss of these educators, in a situation where there was already chronic shortage of specialists due to Israeli siege, long-standing Israeli siege, the longest siege in modern history on any place in the world, has caused the collapse of several medical modules. And now, you have volunteer doctors stepping in to sustain the curriculum with uneven results. That's the situation in IUG. Moving on to Azhar, which is the other medical school. Azhar University faced parallel devastation. October 2023, Israeli airstrikes targeted AEG's Faculty of Medicine and the Faculty of Dentistry as well, because, we don't want good teeth also. Destroying all medical teaching laboratories, including smart classrooms, 2 simulation labs, 2 anatomy labs, histology lab, pathology and emergency lab, and surgical training facilities. At least 31 students in Azhar, medical students, have been killed since the onset of the genocide. As for the faculty, they include Dr. Hassam Hamada in pathology, Rifat al-Lubbad in internal medicine, and several others. Many of the faculty that were not murdered have either evacuated the Gaza Strip, are living in makeshift tents, or are no longer reachable. Okay. This is not to mention, of course, the mass displacement of all students, all colleagues, all administrators. It's a total disaster. The cultural centers, another area of social reproduction. Same thing. The majority of cultural centers in Gaza have been destroyed. You cannot imagine the amount of disruption to Palestinian social life and our colleagues that have been engaged in sustaining the cultural aspect of that social life. You might think, okay, what's the importance of culture in a situation where medicine is being bombed or food is not being... Actually, culture can keep people's morale going. But they don't want people to have morale. They don't want them to have access to plays or shows or drama, which Gaza had a thriving scene of. There was the Shawa Cultural Center in Gaza. That was one of the earliest places that they bombed. It was a major and important place for performing arts, for musical shows. Gone. The community libraries, they're gone. History, I'm a historian, so this matters to me. Over 100 major listed historical sites have been destroyed. There was special care taken to destroy people's religious sites. So in particular, the Islamic ones, but also the Christian ones, including some of the world's oldest churches. The third oldest church in the world was targeted. One of the oldest mosques in the world, the Almari Mosque, which had even survived the Mongol invasions, were totally destroyed, with a precious manuscript library in it that is essential for Islamic studies in the future. The cemeteries were destroyed. A lot of the historic cemeteries housing tombs of many different figures. Important for people also to be able to make sense of their world. They're also destroyed. Greek, Roman, and before that Canaanite sites. All of them destroyed. All eras of human civilization that we know of. And by the way, Gaza is an important center for human civilization because it is the connecting point between Asia and Africa. There is no other place that connects Asia and Africa by land. Okay? That's why Gaza was always there as a city and as a territory. Of course, it's a fertile place. Wouldn't be able to tell that from the images now. But Gaza used to be filled with orchards, citrus orchards, beautiful trees. It's a prime example of beautiful. And by the way, in the last quarter of the 20th century, it was filled with flowers. People used to grow a lot of flowers in Gaza. It was a major exporting center of flowers to Europe. All of that, of course, is gone. The intentional salination of the whole place, ensuring that even the soil itself no longer gets fresh water, is ongoing at a systematic pace. It's a horrific reality. It is a genocidal reality. It is a blemish on our conscience as people and as scholars. How does this intersect with the American humanities? I mean, we've already said they've been silent, of course. But let's think about their silence. In our fields, and I mean it in the organized collective sense, and especially in the United States, have failed to work to prevent the genocide to begin with. Their upper echelons have even overwhelmingly refused to acknowledge it. And I really want to emphasize the word refuse, because they were asked to repeatedly and insistently, and from multiple quarters, including from Palestinian academics working in the global north, but also, and more importantly, by afflicted Palestinian universities, scholars, and writers in occupied Gaza. The history of the Western Academy will forever be marked by shameful pandering, the moral failure, and the betrayal of human life that we are witnessing. For unlike previous genocides in recent history, this one is being committed by the principal Western powers and is being observed by the academic leaderships in the West, and sometimes it is being promoted by them. It cannot be said that our colleagues did not know. The genocide, as is often remarked, was the first to be live-streamed in history. And initially, the hope was that social media would break the siege imposed on Gaza by mainstream Western media, and that the horror would have to stop after all the images and stories reached the citizens of the world. Now, the media siege was broken, despite the anti-Palestinian crackdowns by Meta and Alphabet, and the forced takeover of TikTok over the Gaza genocide, by the way. But the heightened exposure did not beget political change. Now, Yahya Ashur, another poet, captured the feelings of besieged Gazans in relation to this. If it is unable to break the siege upon us, I want the world to seize our connection with it on the internet. I want the world to find rest away from us, much more than I want us to find rest away from it. There was more goodwill towards a mobilization on behalf of Palestinians than ever before, but this was not enough to overthrow entrenched interests and prejudices, including in the academy. This led many Palestinian intellectuals to despair of the inaction of the sections of humanity and the ineffectiveness of others. And their feelings were summarized yet again by Ashur. I'm quoting here, "No street or ruler from east or west wipes away death from your forehead, O Gaza. No street or ruler even offers condolence. The planes must have prevented their intervention. Don't worry, Gaza. It is said that death is a blessing that is missed by the immortal." Despite all this despair, Gaza did not cease its appeals to the world. And this was especially the case when it came to our colleagues. On May 29, 2024, academics from across Gaza, Palestine, published an open letter urging, quote, friends and colleagues around the world to resist the ongoing campaign of Scholasticide in occupied Palestine, to work alongside us in rebuilding our demolished universities, and to refuse all plans seeking to bypass, erase, or weaken the integrity of our academic institutions. This call, they reminded us, was issued, quote, from beneath the bombs of the occupation forces across occupied Gaza and the refugee camps of Rafah, and from the sites of temporary new exile in Egypt and other host countries, end of quote. And it was disseminated, quote, as the Israeli occupation continues to wage its genocidal campaign against our people daily in its attempt to eliminate every aspect of our collective and individual life, end of quote. Now, all signatories to the Charter lost their universities, for, as I mentioned before, no campus in Gaza was spared, with every demolition accompanied by a perverse celebration on social media by Israeli soldiers, young soldiers often recruited from or headed in the future to Israeli university campuses. Israeli university campuses are being supported and funded from the United States by universities from the United States. Universities here go out of their way to engage in partnerships with these institutions that bring little profit to them, but much benefit to the Israeli institutions. This is often pushed by donors and state governors and others within the university infrastructure that are keen to promote genocide in Palestine. Now, all our colleagues in Gaza have lost their homes, where Israel had destroyed most dwellings in Gaza using our bombs. All have been internally or externally displaced. We know all of this. We talked about it over and over again. And by the way, the individual cases I mentioned to you of death, they constitute now 10% of Gaza's academic faculty have been killed. Because there's around 200 faculty members have been killed, and the university professors working in Gaza around 2,000. So when you destroy 10% of the academic, can you imagine if 10% of your colleagues are murdered? It's unbelievable. Not counting, by the way, the much higher percentages of people injured or people suffering from lack of medical treatment. Now, despite its unspeakable horror, Palestinian academics in Gaza found the resilience and courage to insist on their belief in the humanist principles that inspired them to be educators in the first place. We refuse, they announced, to allow such acts to extinguish the flame of knowledge and resilience that burns within us. The future of our young people in Gaza depends upon us and our ability to remain on our land in order to continue to serve the coming generations of our people. We built these universities from tents, and from tents, with the support of our friends, we will rebuild them once again. That's a very powerful statement for me. And it's referring, of course, to the fact that when Gaza's universities were first established, by the way, Israeli occupation officials did not allow buildings to be erected because they would not allow the universities to be registered in the first place. They didn't want universities anywhere in occupied Palestine. So people started teaching from tents, and that's how the first university in Gaza, the Islamic University, began. Years later, they managed to develop these buildings, especially after the Oslo process, but now all of them are destroyed. Now, Gaza scholars, at least those of them that have survived, have kept their promise of teaching from tents, relaunching higher education through distance learning, working without pay, under the bombs, and with limited access to electricity, internet, and even food. That was an effort that was coordinated by Gaza's universities through the Emergency Committee of Gaza Universities, which was established as a representative body of them, coordinating body between the three major nonprofit universities, the big three universities in Gaza. And they basically have been doing heroic work since actually a few months after the genocide. By June 2024, they were able to restore online teaching, learning from previous experiences under COVID. The work that is being done is enormous and impressive, and it has received zero support from any single administrator in the United States. Not a single university has helped with this. Contrast this with Ukraine, where there was immediate movement on the part of all the administrators to issue statements, offer funding, offer support, and they offered the support to the Ukrainian system on a national basis, not just a university-to-university basis. So they had a national plan for dealing with a national sector. This is not just restricted to the United States. All of Europe was operating along those principles. Enormous resources went to support the universities there, and rightly so, why not? I mean, in any afflicted zone. But in this case, it's the US doing the work, and not a single academic leader in the US is daring to say a word. Now, there's a crisis, and the crisis within the US Academy, I think, is partly the outcome of steady advances made in the US Academy over the past few decades. Reaction, after all, is a response to change, and change in this case unfolded on four interconnected levels: the social, the demographic, the moral, and the intellectual. At least since the 1960s, a slow but sure demographic transformation witnessed the entry into the US humanities and social sciences and even sciences of scholars from diverse racialized backgrounds that were adversely affected by global colonialism. In the US, much of the solidarity with the Palestinian people and the resistance to pro-genocidal thought has come from Native, Latinx, Arab, African, and Asian American ranks, as well as from scholars that were born and raised in the global South. And this change in the composition of our departments, slow and uneven as it was, influenced patterns of thought, and it had an impact on scholars that came from European backgrounds. Thus, we have witnessed the rise of a growing constituency of critical Jewish scholars, for example, that have been troubled by the ongoing eliminationist impact that Zionism has had on the Palestinian people. We've also seen greater engagement of younger generation scholars from other white backgrounds that received their training after the post-colonial and decolonial turns. And last but not least, the greater embrace of the Palestinian cause on the part of the left has produced greater commitment within the ranks of radical feminists, queer, and Marxist intellectuals of all generations. Any observer of conversations unfolding in departments across the US will notice that explicit challenges to the genocide tend to be driven by racialized scholars, progressive Jews, early career academics, and radical thinkers of all backgrounds. These scholars remain a minority, but they are outspoken amidst the sea of silence and vocal aggression. The thoughts and actions of these scholars were, of course, driven by social movements, as is well established now intellectually. And in the heydays of explicit European imperial dominance, the humanities and social sciences were a breeding ground for colonial thought. Our fields produced modes of thought that justified colonialism, giving it ideological cover and a sense of moral purpose, as well as training its so-called men on the spot. Pockets of resistance to this reality existed within the ranks of the academic radical left, but even the rejection of imperialist projects did not necessarily entail a departure from Eurocentricity or engagement with the colonized on their own terms. However, as Anwar Abdel Malik noted in a classic essay written decades and decades ago, the meteoric rise of national liberation movements in the colonies in the middle of the 20th century prompted some change, causing Orientalism to go into crisis. This was accompanied by the growth of civil rights movements in the metropoles, that challenged the very basis of racialist thought that undergirded colonialism. Whenever social movements waxed, partly through student and progressive faculty mobilizing on campus, and partly through broader social shifts outside of campus, the manifest impulse to reproduce the existing order without any dissent or challenge waned. New ways of thinking, of seeing, of being on our campuses were always connected to shifts in the social balance of power, and more often than not, played a contributing role in spurring those shifts. Now, specific to Palestine, change was also spurred by accumulated encounters with Palestinian scholars, decades of Palestinian emancipatory organizing across the world, and years of Palestinian intellectual production, including in the West. It is not coincidental that some of the most profound epistemological and methodological shifts in our field could be attributed to the work of Edward Said, whose assault on Orientalism, elaborations on the relationship between culture and empire, and the promotion of anti-colonial theories and theorists from across the world played a foundational theoretical role. And this was supplemented, of course, by conceptual work done by Palestinians in major subdisciplines, some of it having direct relevance to the genocidal present. Kerman Abulsi, for example, demonstrated that we cannot understand contemporary war, not the least in colonial situations like that in Palestine, without accounting for the contrasting traditions that underlie different conceptions and practices of war, and the colonial and anti-colonial interests that these traditions serve. Now, the change in theory, in epistemology, in method, and in morality was accompanied by a change in empirical production. Early generation of Palestinian Arab scholars, writing in the 50s, 60s, 80s, 70s, 80s, transformed our understanding of the Arab region as a whole, including Palestine. Now, this meant that within Middle East studies, for example, the battle was won, despite regular pushback from neo-Orientalists. Now, no serious scholar in that field can deny the Palestinian Nakba, for example, or its aftermath today. And given the new moral standards we adhere to, no serious scholar can deny the imperatives arising out of that horror. There are currents of denial existing within the rest of the humanities and social sciences, but they are not rooted in empirical knowledge and they lack moral consistency in general. As any Palestinian who's had to grapple with these currents would confirm, they are intellectually weak, propelled by ignorance, latent colonial or racial prejudice, national chauvinism, religious fundamentalism, sheer opportunism, or a combination of some or all of the above. For those that care to know, the Palestinian people and their cause are noble today. And so is Israel and its subto-colonial nature. They're equally noble. No amount of denial can erase the fact that the vast majority of Jewish Israelis came very recently from outside Palestine, and that they were a colonist minority in that land until their armed militias drove out the Palestinian people and took over their homes and lands in 1947, 1949. No amount of sophistry can erase the fact that after driving the natives out, the colonists established a state that prevented the return of Palestinian refugees to their homes and lands, violating every norm of international refugee law in the process. No amount of obfuscation can bury forever the fact that Israel subjected the native Palestinian population that remains to various regimes of domination, oppression, humiliation, suppressing their collective political, national, civil, social, economic, and religious rights, as well as their individual liberties, culminating now with this genocide. And after years of denial, the human rights community now is united in viewing Israel as an apartheid state. Its major organizations, including Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, B'Tselem, and others, have established that fact with unprecedented meticulousness and rigor. And for its part, the International Court of Justice has ruled that Israel is a state that is practically violating every major tenet of international law to maintain its unlawful occupation of the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. It has also found that Israel is carrying out plausibly genocidal policy in Gaza today. As for the International Criminal Court, it has now issued the arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, and the two are international fugitives wanted for war crimes. Now, all of this is going on, and we still have administrators refusing to issue a statement in support of Palestinian universities, recognizing Scholasticide, or doing any major collaboration with Palestinian universities on the ground. So, what does this tell us about our own reality? We mentioned a democratic deficit, but there's much more going on with this than that. There's also a situation where there is serious contempt. There's contempt towards academics, towards our fields. There's contempt towards students. If the students are protesting, it's not what they're protesting against that is wrong. They are wrong. And this has led now to the rise of this criminalizing discourse that has been adopted willingly by administrators across campuses, even though any serious observer, any rational person, any person with a heart of humanity would be able to tell that this is designed to promote genocide denial. I will say something, almost every administrator in the United States is engaged in genocide denial by engaging in activities that suppress the students. If you're trying to silence those that are trying to speak out against genocide, you're practicing something worse than genocide denial. You're actually preventing genocide prevention. So you're complicit in the genocide. Even those that think of themselves as great liberal administrators. Oh, I didn't inflict too many harsh punishments on them. It was minor. Unlike you engaging, you're complicit in the genocide. Because not only did you not do anything to stop it, you also put obstacles in the face of people who are trying to stop it. You've created an atmosphere that made academics afraid of speaking out against it. So, yes, we can talk about our less radical colleagues as being complicit, but had the atmosphere been a bit favorable, they might have spoken out. They might have mobilized. A lot of people worry about their own individual lives. They're not willing to put themselves on the line, even to stop the killing of others. But, under the right circumstances, they would do the right thing, maybe, if they didn't worry about being fired or facing discipline or punishment. So this is a general rot that we are facing in this country. And I think the only solution has been mobilizing and organizing, and it continues to be. My own field, I've been involved in that through the American Historical Association, trying to fight there, and we got 2 resolutions passed 2 years in a row, condemning the Scholasticide in Gaza and calling for support for our Palestinian colleagues there, with overwhelming majorities in the business meetings, but they're being suppressed by the leadership. They vetoed them twice, and they're refusing to take it to a membership general vote. So they come and tell you, we don't care about this. We have a fiduciary responsibility. It's not to our membership. It's to the organization. Why don't you want to do it? Oh, we'll get destroyed by the government. Same argument over and over again. It's made by administrators. It's made by the leaderships of major learned societies. What that tells us is this idea that this country is a country of liberty. It's a total illusion. Of course, scholars have known this for a long time. There is no liberty in the United States. There is a quest for proximity to power, and in some case, not even proximity to power, just performing for power. Our colleagues in Gaza and the people they are serving are paying the price with their own lives, unfortunately. Thank you.
Firstly, thank you for an incredible talk. That was really powerful, and I learned loads from it. The very first thing you said was that this is in part an American genocide. And so I wanted to ask you about one particular aspect of that. And this might seem like a stupid question, but the question is why? That is to say, what is it about the interest of the American state that are being protected right now? The reason I say that is, so I'm from the UK, and it's often invoked that Britain and the US have a special relationship. But the truly special relationship is between Israel and the US. Not only is Israel the largest recipient of military aid in the world, it's the largest recipient of civilian aid. It's the only country in the world that's allowed to bypass the State Department and deal directly with US arms manufacturers. It's the only country in the world that's allowed to spend its civilian aid budget on additional weapons. And in the conflict over the last year, there were various threats about perhaps some of that budget could be removed. And it seemed to have very little impact is the first thing. And so I suppose my first question is, how much of an impact would that have? But also secondly, it's been invoked that I've always thought of Israel as, to some extent, a US aircraft carrier in the Middle East, which supports the interests of the US in the region. And that is one of the reasons why the US funds it on the basis that it does so. However, it's increasingly seeming like Israel is somewhat unaccountable to American foreign policy interests. I'm just wondering why it is that the US and the political elites in the US continue to maintain this relationship when the dynamics over, say, 20 years ago seem to have changed.
So this is a very important question, and I think there's been a long-standing debate on the left on it. In general, there's been a long-standing debate on it, but I'll speak about the traditional left position is the position you mentioned. It's a U.S. aircraft carrier, etc. I never believed that. Usually people base that position on the idea that there's oil in this region. They needed a state to protect that oil. So they put the state of Israel. Originally, I'm a scholar of the Gulf, actually, and I've looked at state formation there and the oil. I've read archives on the Gulf in their formative period. So I can say that with some humility, I can say that I know a bit more than most of the people that have intervened in that debate, and that intervened without having studied any of the documents, not gone back to the archive. If you look in from the early on, when the British were setting up the system there around the oil, they were citing the Jewish colonization in Palestine as a liability, as a serious liability for the sustenance of imperial interests in the region, because it generates opposition to the general project. By the way, secular colonialism, and this is something that not many people realize, secular colonialism creates much more disturbance regionally than traditional colonialism. The whole of the Arab world was traditionally colonized. Okay, every single Arab country, except for the Sultanate of Najd and to some extent the Imamate of Yemen and the north of Yemen. But all of these areas, even those were indirectly colonized in some way or another. Okay, but the two areas that have generated a massive change in the region, traditionally the two causes were Algeria. If you look in the 50s and 60s, that caused huge transformative impacts in the Maghreb, and Palestine since the Balfour Declaration to this day. Because settler colonialism does that. I mean, it did that in South Africa. You know, if you look at the apartheid regime there and the impacts it had on Namibia or Angola, it's a destabilizing impact on everything around it. Because settler colonialism has a voracious appetite. It doesn't stop and doesn't know how to stop. Okay, these are people brought from outside. They come to a place and they are faced, correctly as they say, when they say we're faced with the hostile neighbor, they're right, because they're trying to take over territory of others. They're trying to take over land and resources that are owned by others. So of course, the same way that in this country, there was native resistance, of course. Okay, it's very destabilizing, settler colonialism, because it's very aggressive. So from the beginning, it was understood by those that were involved actually in setting up policy around these areas, almost always said this is not good. And in the US, this was the case. Many people on the left who pontificate about Israel as just an instrument of US. Well, they don't account for the fact that usually the US experts on Middle East did not promote the Israeli project. Within the State Department, there was always this class of people referred to by the Israel lobby as the Arabists. These are people who actually knew something about the region, lived there, studied about it, understood the situation there, and they did not think it was a good idea. These were imperialists, by the way. They're not great people by our standards. Okay, they believed in imperialism. They certainly believed in U.S. dominance across the world, but they did not think that promoting the settler colonial project is the best way to ensuring that. If you look at the treaties, the major figure that had existed on the Arab arena was Gamal Abdel Nasser, president of Egypt. There were multiple cases in which Gamal Abdel Nasser sought directly to establish good relations with the United States, got turned away over Israel. Now, people will tell you, oh, they were trying to undermine pan-Arabism by creating the Israeli project and etc. You know, they're confusing things because also they confuse stages of history also. They were, you know, the American support for Israel comes a bit earlier, even before Israel becomes a state. There's different forms of supporting the colonists there. But when you look at the period in the 50s, which was foundational, the U.S. had a choice. It could have struck an alliance with Egypt easily. That would have guaranteed a lot of regional open doors for the U.S. Okay, would have meant, by the way, an American moment in the Middle East, a long-standing American moment. It's still controlled by the region now, by the way, but it came at a greater cost. Zionism, as far as I'm concerned, is a social and political movement with deep roots in U.S. and Western societies. Some of these roots have to do with religious factors. Some of them have to do with material factors. And some of them have to do with, exile community factors. So you have one constituency that supports Zionism today, which is, of course, a Christian evangelical Zionist. Those don't care about geopolitical interests. They don't think of, they actually tell you, my geopolitics is the Bible. Okay, and they really mean it. They're not like, this is not a group of people that is acting on the basis of interest calculations when it comes to the United States. Now, of course, some of their preachers are infiltrated by Israeli money. Okay, so there is a whole financial aspect to this. Some of the money they collect for Israel, there's a lot of corruption around that. But at the heart of it, the constituency is organized on an ideological, religious basis. Okay. Then you have another constituency, which sometimes people find it difficult to talk about, but we can talk about it sociologically. There is an older generation of Jews in the United States that are committed to Israel on an emotional and sometimes nationalist basis. Okay, they really believe in this project. Okay, or it's a personal thing for them. They're nationalists. Okay, they believe in Jewish nationalism. Palestinians don't feature in their calculations or thoughts. And as a result, they're not concerned about the effects on this on Palestinians. This contrasts by, for example, younger generations of Jews in this country, and ones that tend to come from more middle class, working class backgrounds. You have a different outlook. A lot of them are practicing Palestinian solidarity now. So we see also sociological trends that are emerging now that are very interesting. Amongst evangelicals, of course, we see also changes because of the rise of the different current in the MAGA movement. And I would have never thought I would say this, but I now follow Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens, and not doesn't mean that I like what they say, by the way. But it's interesting to follow because it's a conversation that's going on in that quarter that is causing big challenges to core long-lasting beliefs, around this. It's not a conversation that I necessarily believe on the main foundations of it. It has different moral code and different, but there is a whole change that's happening there. And then, of course, yes, military-industrial complex, yes, it is there, but that was going to be there regardless. And actually, the Israeli side of the equation has not been the strongest on that. Historically, that has depended on the peculiar position of Gulf states and their weakness in relation to their three main actual factors in that region, which has always been Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. Okay, so the smaller Gulf states need protection from these bigger neighbors, and Saudi Arabia itself needs protection from its two competitors. So they need American support for that, and that's a dynamic in which Israel is actually an obstacle to it. They want to buy more expensive weapons historically. They want, from the early 80s, we saw the fight over the AWACS, for example, and when it comes to Saudi Arabia. Now they want the latest generation fighter jets. They want all of that. They're not allowed to have it because the Israelis are saying no. So it's a complicated picture. I think the geopolitical dimension is never actually discussed in a serious way. There is in U.S. circles now, because since the Clintons took power, they purged the Arabs. Most of the State Department now has a lot of pro-Israel planners on it, and then that relationship is very much governed by those kind of dynamics. So I think to think about it as a very vigorous social and political movement is the best way forward. And by the way, I should caution here against people that have, this is not suggesting that this is some kind of, some people promote anti-Semitic theories on that or anything like that. We should reject that, of course. This is, when we analyze, this is not about promoting hatred, but it's actually about saying, let's take sociological realities very seriously.
Please. To follow up on the question and also, of course, your answer to the question as to why specifically the U.S. is still supporting even within the change of the power dynamics. My question would be, why can you explain and how can you explain that, not from an elitist point of view, but if you can explain how scholars belonging to not the ones who have been trained in the social justice, coming from the global south as we are coming, and not the ones, of course, who are Zionist, pro-Israeli, very evangelic Christians ideology and so on. So let's extract all of those. But the really big majority, unfortunately, the white liberal scholars who are in their work, we have been all trained by our training to be defending rights, to be using methodology, embedded into scholarly conducted methodology, and so on and so forth. So how would you explain, to say the least, their silence? Their neutrality when this is happening, and then people are still saying, "Hi, how was your summer? It was late," stuff like that. How would you explain that? Because this is something that I'm really struggling with every single day for the last 3 years, if not before, but even more after October 7.
Well, let me start by saying that historically, the majority of people, and I'm talking here statistical terms, are not involved in solidarity movements or even movements by the way to resist occupations in their own countries. This is not a popular conception. It's hard for me to say that. Unfortunately, I would like it to be different. But if you look at the case, for example, of, I'll give you a famous example in historical scholarship. There was an important scholar of the French resistance to the Nazis, Robert Gilder, wrote a book that caused a bit of controversy in press because he showed that the amount of people that were involved actually in the resistance against the Nazis was about 1% to 2%. I can't remember the exact figure, but it was something like that. And then everybody was, no, everybody was fighting against the Nazis. The fact of the matter is everybody tries to live a normal life for the most part, because fighting against injustice often comes at personal cost. So
I'm not talking about fighting or resisting or protesting. Even, share their thoughts.
Yeah.
So
well, even share, I understand. But even sharing your thoughts then would produce such a level of dissonance. Okay, that you don't want to even go there. People then adapt to the realities around it. So what you have now is a reality where there's been generations of depoliticized scholars, and there's been the production. And I really think that that answering this question fully requires the sociologists of that studies these facts in very serious and applied ways. I can give you my own slightly anecdotal based, but maybe I've had to think about it too, both as an organizer and scholar. But this requires real, close study. And there is a lot of study on this. Why don't people participate in politics? Why don't they even engage in sharing or any of that? But I would say that what you had in general, when it comes to Palestine, is such a high level of policing of thought. People don't want to sound like haters because you get accused of being an anti-Semite if you share a word about this. Okay, people also are afraid of saying the wrong thing. Okay, because if they worry, I don't have enough knowledge about this. What if I get wrong? I'll offend somebody. People are surrounded by colleagues that are pro-Israel historically. And this is changing. But again, there are still remnants of that. So, and you see it in generational terms very clearly. It's more likely that you'll have an assistant professor come and express views of solidarity or views of like me, like I don't like what's going on with their colleagues and tenure professors. Why? Because the tenure professor is thinking about his cohort. They don't want their colleague to be upset, their Zionist colleague to be upset of like, oh, they said something wrong, you offended me. And they don't know how to respond to that because they don't have the basis in knowledge or the deep access to knowledge to do that. And plus, their political world already is shaped on a basis that is either liberal or potentially to the right of liberals. I mean, this is where, it's so ridiculous when you read the media and these stupid statistics that they do. Most academics are on the hard left or whatever. Like, what is the left you're referring to? If you're talking Clinton is left, then sure, but the Clinton left is pro-genocide, okay? And they're pro-colonialism. And they're pro-anti-working class positions that have destroyed actually any sense of solidarity in this country. This is the other dimension that I want to mention here, and before I forget. The weakness of Western solidarity in general has coincided with the destruction of collective organizations in the West. So when you used to have the union movement, unfortunately, the union movement was very Zionist. So there was no space to promote Palestinian rights. When the union movement was destroyed or weakened significantly, there are attempts now, there are sections of it that are improving on the question of Palestine. It's a much weaker movement than it was before. So this is the irony we're dealing with. I was talking to Robin Kelly about this a while back, because he was like, the American Union movement had actually done something. For example, in 47, around the partition resolution, they could have actually potentially influenced it in major ways. They still had a say in Democratic Party politics, and So when people I deal with life as monadic individuals, it's difficult for them to come and say something. And now in this environment of fear, even the Clinton so-called left, whatever that means, is being attacked now on campuses. Look at all these civic leadership initiatives they're setting up now. In Ohio, I don't know if you're following this trend. Ohio State University now has set up a civic leadership center, which civic citizenship. What is it called? Something I can't remember what it is. Really terrible. They're pouring in huge amounts of money, and they're giving students $4,000 tuition waivers if they come and attend these very right-wing courses in it. They're saying the academy needs to be transformed completely. That's why you had the Texan tenure that started here in Wisconsin. They're being spread massively now. There's a whole scene of attacking people institutionally, which means then that individually they can't respond. But by the way, I think there are others in this room that might have opinions on this. Maybe we should listen to them about that, because I would love to hear what people have to say, unless there are other questions. I do think there is a conversation to be had around this.
I don't have anything to add to that, but I'm just like very curious. I'm a first year PhD student, and interestingly, in these times, I'm actually working on my research towards like how humanitarian funding kind of like influences, and the theory I'm working on is like epistemic injustice, and I'm definitely looking at displaced scholars because I'm from Nigeria, and the Boko Haram crisis and things, and now there's like military presence in Nigeria, the US military. And I'm just wondering how certain uses of certain languages around scholars, like the use of the word scholasticide, I'm really like interested in it, but also the language of how funding is now connotated. Like funding for scholars would be like emergency funding, or scholars have to have certain statuses for them to access funding. So you have to maybe identify yourself as a refugee. And what does that kind of, I want to hear your understanding of how what it's going to replicate in the future, and what it means for scholars that now have to access that funding to continue their practice, but in like universities with neoliberal and settler colonialism, kind of like ideologies that believe or that perpetrate and continue to like reproduce itself. I'm like that's what I'm thinking about. I'm wondering what's your own like understanding of the concept of like funding and what it does, and definitely like true humanitarian aid, and like what are the risks as well for scholars, and what are the risks also for displaced students and learners in this situation.
Well, this question I could answer much more concretely, and it's less, because we've done a lot of work actually on it, and I can tell you that in the case of Gaza, for example, initially when the genocide first started, you had all these initiatives to support individual scholars, and some of them were under the rubric of scholars at risk programs. Others, they were established international scholars at risk programs. Others were just people saying, like, raise some money for this individual, raise some money for that individual, or try to get a fellowship or a scholarship here or there. The model that Gaza universities and those Palestinian scholars working with them, like myself, were promoting was very different. Because we were saying, actually, this contributes not only to brain drain, but to destroying the institutions there. So in a way, actually, it helps the genocide without having intention of doing that. And, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Mm-hmm. So actually, the best way and best practice is not to treat it individual. This is a national crisis afflicting a whole educational sector that is threatened, not only threatened, but it's actually experiencing annihilation. So the way to deal with it is, first of all, recognize that the universities are still there despite the destruction of buildings. Because we go back to the original concept of what a university is. A university is a community of scholars. So long as the university faculty, the administrators, and the students are alive, then the university is alive. Okay, we start from that premise. The next step then is, if you want to do support for a scholar, or you want to do funding, you don't treat it as an individual fellowship or a scholarship. What you do is you establish a connection with the universities directly and through a coordinated mechanism. That's why we set up the emergency committee of Gaza universities, because then the universities are a unified body that speaks to the outside world and then can distribute these fellowships and scholarships without actually causing brain drain or loss to the core faculty or the students. Okay, and that doesn't mean that you don't support people who made it outside. It just means that you keep the formal process going of, like, I recognize that these people belong to institutions that are not gone, and I will support them, but it's done in a way that does not undermine the collective and promote the individual. Because, by the way, when you just promote the individual, you're dealing with it in a depoliticized manner, and you're actually not serving the broader causes. This was incidentally the case not just in when it comes to Palestine, when it comes to any issue. If you really want to help, you don't just promote individuals, which was always the flow, by the way, in the U.S. approach to these things, even when it comes to marginalized communities in this country. Because the solution is to create institutional resilience, collective resilience, and that is the way forward. So this is what we continue to insist on now. Unfortunately, by the way, the only program that has worked to support Palestinian universities along these principles was a Palestinian program. Isnad, which was very involved in setting that, and Isnad was done by the Gaza universities with the largest NGO in Palestine, Ta'awun, and it's the only one that has been covering the running costs of the universities while providing scholarships to students on that basis of, like, it goes through actually the universities themselves. So it still recognizes that, treats them as such. Now, the contrast, by the way, with how many universities that are deflated is shocking. Because there it's all about the institutional, not the individual. There's institutional linkages with hundreds of universities in the US, many more in the West. They get institutional status when it comes to, for example, the Horizons program in Europe, which has given them billions of dollars over the years. they're treated as a European country more so than Switzerland, for example. Switzerland is not allowed to all the funds of Horizon, but Israel is. So they get access, any Israeli scientist can access the top EU research funds, and there's incentives for EU scientists to do work with them. They'll get like extra points. So if you wonder sometimes, people come tell you, Israeli miracle, blah, blah. I'm like, Israeli miracle is not a miracle at all. They're getting huge amounts of money from the US and EU to be the artificial settler colony they are, because it is artificial. When you keep pumping money into something. But then they tell you, oh, they did the technological miracle. They established this company that, and like, who's funding it? NASDAQ. That's where the money is being raised for it. There, it's US capital, you know, and in many cases, EU technological fund. But it's dealt with at an institutional basis. So the forces of oppression are supported collectively. The oppressed people are treated as individuals. And by the way, as a Palestinian, we've always learned this lesson. If you want to join the West, you can easily. Just renege your collective identity, turn yourself into a subservient individual. Everybody will love you even. They'll promote you. They won't even love you. Same, by the way, for all oppressed and racialized communities that I know of. If you renege your identity, act against it, you know, you'll have a great time. You know, that's why we must insist on institutional support, direct relations with Gaza universities. If anyone who wants to do that work, I'm happy to discuss that. There's a lot that could be done. I hope that people in medicine will do something about it.